Now, when a state or a government lacks sufficient revenues to account for its expenditures, this means that it incurs a deficit. Either the government at that point will need to spend down some of its accumulated treasure and wealth, or it will necessarily need to borrow from someone in order to have the resources to match those particular expenditures. Now, it's important that from an economic point of view that we understand what the consequence of a government borrowing against future revenues are to meet current expenditures. The biggest thing to remember is that the notion of borrowing now to repay in the future ultimately represents a form of delayed taxation. Even though we are not taxing people today, because we've borrowed, we will necessarily have to tax people in the future in order to make up for this. Now, this is not to say automatically that borrowing is bad. From a purely financial point of view, most businesses will make use of debt capital to be able to invest in large-scale capital projects which add a lot of value. Similarly, if we had government expenditures which would result in a net positive value for society, it would be important for us to borrow in the short term to ensure longer-term stability. Now, the accumulated government deficit from period to period is its total public debt. Total amount of debt that the government owes will either be owed to foreigners or to its own local citizenry. Now, it's important for us to distinguish between these two because who supplies capital to the states can have a very important impact on a government's ability to raise funds in a crisis. For instance, we saw during the financial crisis 10 years ago in Greece that the fact that they had relied so heavily on foreigners to finance their debt left them in a very challenging situation once those foreigners decided to stop supporting the Greek state. Conversely, in 1172, the Venetians realized they could only rely on themselves in their war against the Byzantines, and as a result, they decided to finance their own government expenditures domestically, you might say. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of internal debt, what the Venetians did compared to external debt, which is what the Greek government did. In many nations, a large portion of the government's debt is actually held internally by its citizens or its financial institutions. Citizens may have channeled their money to the government through banks, insurance company, investment funds, pensions, but at the end of the day, if that money is being channeled to our own state, we have what's effectively called internal debt, where the government owes its money either directly or indirectly to its own citizens. In Canada, roughly 70% of our national debt is owned domestically. In the United States, it's approximately 2/3 of their debt that is owned domestically. In Japan, it's over 95%. To give you an idea about simply redistributing our money within our own society, providing loans to our state in order to keep it functioning, it's worth noting that when the Bank of Canada made loans to the government of Canada in 2020, in the early stages of the COVID pandemic, this money was not being printed up. Instead, this money was actually borrowed from the commercial banking sector and then lent to the government itself. So the central bank played a role in making sure that Canadians' household savings, which would otherwise be sitting idle in the bank, were actually put to use, helping Canadians to finance their state at a time when coordination failure seemed highly likely. Now, when we take a look at the notion of external debt, things are a little bit trickier. When you rely on internal debt, you can often rely on the notion that your citizens support the state and may continue to support the state, even though it goes through challenging financial situations. For example, Japan is probably the most classic case in this area. Having a debt to GDP double that of troubled states like Lebanon, we see that the Japanese are proceeding apace, mostly because they've been willing to spend their own money financing their own state. Things are very different when you have to rely on foreigners to be able to finance the expenditures of your state. As long as the money looks good or the return looks good to them, they may very well be willing to continue supporting it. But the real concern is what happens when foreigners no longer see the value add in putting their money to work in your country. As you can see in the graph at the top of this slide, you'll see that we are looking at the interest rate on Greek government bonds. And you'll notice here that there's a particular spike that occurs in these government bond yields, reaching a high of almost 30% at one point in 2012, before finally settling back down to the levels that we see them at today. So it's important for us to recognize what the potential consequences are of not financing our own governments. When we finance our own state, we have the ability to continue pouring money into them to some extent. But when we rely on foreigners, the calculus becomes very simple. Canadians may choose to continue financing the Canadian state because we believe in its strategic benefit for our lives, or we believe that it has a direct impact on our well-being above and beyond our finances. But when it comes to, say, British investors or Egyptian investors financing Canada's debt, they're looking for risk-adjusted, non-correlated returns. For the most part, they don't have a particular interest in financing the strategic needs of the Canadian state in the way that Canadians might. So I want to walk you through a couple of examples where things blew up spectacularly for the various governments that relied very heavily on external financing. One of the most famous of these is Germany in 1931. Foreign debt to GDP was already over 100% when Danat Bank failed. The failure of Danat Bank in 1931 in Germany ended up resulting in a bank run that you might say enveloped their entire banking industry and ultimately helped push Germany into the Great Depression. Just 2 years later, Germany had to abrogate all of its foreign debts in 1933, simply declaring that it wasn't going to pay any of the foreigners who had helped to finance Germany throughout the 1920s and early 30s. The Southeast Asia currency crisis in 1997 was remarkably similar. Between 1993 and 1996, debt to GDP in Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, many of the Southeast Asian sort of proto-tiger economies, increased dramatically. And most of that debt was remarkably short-term. What we had here are what are called hot money flows. We had people who had a variety of or a large amount of capital available to invest, with the barriers of the Cold War period declining and making capital more easy to allocate across the world. A large amount of it flowed into Southeast Asia, which was in the 90s seen as being the next batch of tiger economies. Unfortunately, many of these countries had pegged the value of their currency to the US dollar, meaning that when the US dollar began to raise the interest rate that underlay it, they had to raise interest rates as well, which took some of the wind out of the sails of their local economies. Faced with the situation of either driving their economies into a recession, many of them simply, the central banks, simply did not have the ammunition to be able to maintain their currency pegs. Many of them had fairly thin amounts of reserves that were ultimately expended trying to maintain these pegs, even though they weren't willing to raise interest rates. At the end of the day, several of these Southeast Asian nations were forced to recognize that they simply did not have a currency that was as strong as the US dollar. And as a result, they devalued their currencies, leading to a massive outflow of investment capital from Southeast Asia that set off a recession all across the entire Pacific Rim. The case of Greece in 2010 through 2013 is equally illustrative. Government debt rose enormously between 2008 and 2010 following the initial financial crisis that had developed in the US subprime mortgage market. In this particular case, the economy of Greece quickly comes off the tracks as government debt increases from almost 110% of GDP to nearly 150% of GDP. The challenge for Greece is that less than 1/3 of that government debt was supplied by Greek people, which meant that as soon as foreigners felt that there was a real risk to not getting paid, they simply refused to roll over Greek government debt, leaving the government with an extraordinary bill and a citizenry unwilling to pay to finance the benefits that they were drawing from. Needless to say, this game of hot potato ultimately erupted and required significant restructuring of both Greek government finances and the structure of Greek government debt.